I mean, I can still hate Copier 2 even if he's not my nemesis, right?
Don't assume the Copier.
Or do I have to make friends? Should I like go chat with Copier 2 and just badmouth Room 80 Wi-Fi router? Be like, oh man, Copier 2, you won't believe what... You know what I heard about Room 80 Wi-Fi router? And he'll be like, what? And I'll be like, oh, it's totally scandalous. Anyway. Oh, yeah. Okay.
That was recorded, right?
Of course. Why wouldn't it be? Okay, so today is 2.7, and this lesson is called Sex-Linked Traits. And we're going to today talk about... we're going to talk about how sometimes Mendel and Punnett squares don't get it quite right, and why that is. I call it sex-linked traits to keep it short. There's actually kind of two components of this note, but that's okay. How many chromosomes do humans have? 46. Good. So inside every single one of the cells in your body right now, there are 46 chromosomes, which means that there are 46 chromosomes that all have different genes on them that all code for different things. We're diploid, which means what?
We have two identical copies of each chromosome.
We have two copies of each chromosome. Do we have two identical copies of each chromosome? That's right. They're not identical. We have two non-identical copies. In fact, we say that those two chromosomes are, there's an H word, meaning that they are the same, nope, haploid means you only have one of them. Chromosomes that have the same genes but not necessarily the same alleles for those genes are homologous pairs. I'm sorry, this is scratching at my nose. I'm going to go with that up for a minute. I guess I'm at my desk. Okay, so the human genome consists of 22 pairs.
22.
Hear me out. Of autosomal chromosomes. What does that mean? Because we have 23 pairs of chromosomes. But you all know this, or I shouldn't say you all know this. Many of you will know that one of your pairs of chromosomes codes just the chromosomes you have themselves, not even the genes on them, code for something kind of interesting, which is people who are biologically male have a different set of chromosomes than people who are biologically female. And what is that difference? What do we call that? Does anyone know?
The Y.
Very good. We're going to talk about the Y and the X chromosome today and what those mean. So first, we need to define all the ones that are neither Y nor X, and these are the autosomal chromosomes. So these are... every human has them. Okay. Well, yeah, no, that's fair. Some people have more, nobody has less. Okay. Every human has them. These are the non-sex chromosomes. In other words, they don't depend on your biological sex. They don't, well, I was going to say they don't affect your biological sex, but that's not true either, so we're not going to say that. Because biological sex is so complicated, you have to kind of speak very precisely to avoid saying things that aren't true. So I'm going to do my best to speak very carefully and avoid saying things that aren't true. The chromosomes 1 through chromosome 22, and typically you have how many copies of each? Yeah, typically 2 copies of each. I say typically because are there some people who have more? Yesterday was actually World's Down Syndrome Day. I believe it was yesterday. It might have been 2 days ago. I lose track of things. But does anyone know what Down syndrome is? You have an extra chromosome. We'll talk about that. That's right. So not everyone only has 46 chromosomes. Not everyone only has 2 copies of each, but that is typical. That is sort of the most common chromosomal arrangement, though it is not the only one. So if that takes care of 22 pairs, how many chromosomes is that then? 22 pairs of autosomal chromosomes, that accounts for 44. But how many do we have? 46. So we have 2 more chromosomes we need to speak about. So let us speak about them. The remaining 2 chromosomes are not autosomal. They're called the sex chromosomes. And unlike the autosomal chromosomes, where everybody has, typically speaking, 2 copies of each, when we speak about the sex chromosomes, there are 2 different possible chromosomes. And I think it was Preston who told us what they were called. What are they called? X and Y. And that's right. So a person can either have 2 X's or an X and a Y. Does anyone have 2 Y's? No. And you can't. Not possible. Not possible to form a human being with 2 Y's because the X chromosome has vital information on it. It's a full chromosome. It codes for lots of stuff. In fact, we'll talk about that. It's not a particularly big one, but the X chromosome has about 800 genes. Does everyone know in math that symbol, the little squiggle tilde, means approximately? While you write that, I'm going to pull up a chromosomal map of X and of Y. Oh, that's, hello, sorry. Damn it. On the other hand, the Y chromosome has substantially fewer genes on it. In fact, the Y chromosome only has about 70 genes. And you do not have to draw this. I just want to show you This is a chromosomal map. And actually, even this doesn't really tell the story because they've drawn them as if they're much more similar in size than they are. The Y chromosome is substantially smaller than the X chromosome. The Y chromosome really is not a particularly functional chromosome. There's not much information on it. It doesn't code for much. In fact, most of the genes, people who are biologically male in this room, there's a common misconception, which is like, oh, all the information to make a male body is held on the Y chromosome, which seems logical, right? Because people who have a Y chromosome have male secondary sex characteristics, and people who don't have a Y chromosome typically don't. But in fact, the overwhelming majority of the genes that make all of your secondary male sex characteristics, right, like different body frame, typically a bulkier frame, wider shoulders, broader shoulders, more heavy set, more muscle mass, obviously like penis and testicles versus other, facial hair, all of these typical secondary sex characteristics are mostly not found on the Y chromosome. They're found in all the other chromosomes. So all the people in this room who are biologically female have all those same genes. And a lot of those genes are still expressed because the genes that make you biologically male aren't that different from the genes that make you biologically female. Often they're the same genes, they're just turned on to different amounts. Women also produce testosterone, they just produce less of it. Men also produce estrogen, they just produce less of it. And again, I'm speaking biologically here. In fact, the Y chromosome mostly has a little switch, a little gene called SRY. And the SRY gene basically says, hey, amp up how often we're accessing all the genes that produce secondary male sex characteristics. If you take a developmental biology class, you'll learn that the male reproductive organs are just overgrown and differently grown versions of the female sex organs. If you actually look at the structures that make them up, they are structurally similar, they're just grown along different paths. SRY just says, use the genes that you already have differently. Does that make sense? And it is not an on-off switch. The thing you learn about your genes is that how they are expressed happens gradationally. It happens, how often a gene gets used is oftentimes much more important than what genes you actually have. In fact, your cells are full of millennia, millions of years of viral attack, of viruses that have come in and injected DNA into our DNA, and they're sitting there right on your chromosomes. The thing is, our bodies just don't read that section of the chromosome. Does that make sense? You actually have all throughout your cells DNA that is designed to kill your cells, but our body says, yeah, don't read that. Like, imagine that. Right? Like, it'd be like, if imagine on your computer keyboard, there are all the normal keys you type, but then there are a few that, like, if you press this, you'll just die. And you'd be like, ooh, I'm going to have a little tape on that one that says, like, don't press that button. But that's what your DNA is like. That's what your genes are like. It's not just what genes you have, it's what genes you use and don't use. And all SRY does is it changes how often different genes are used. Hey, that gene that produces testosterone, we're gonna access that a bit more. We're gonna produce a bit more. Oh, that gene that produces estrogen will produce a bit less of that. And then that, in turn, activates different genes in different body systems and results in different secondary sex characteristics. But if you have this simplistic idea, and God, when people talk about sex and gender, which, by the way, are two different things, they love to throw science out like they know what they're talking about. And you'll see all these things that suggest, well, your genes either tell you that you're male or female. No. That's not true. That's actually not accurate to the biology. It's very, very complicated. And I feel like that's really important to mention because it is really, really complicated. But just know, men, people who identify as male, but people who are biologically male in this room, you have every single gene in you to produce all of the female sex traits. And women in this room, you have every gene in you to produce all of the male sex traits. We know this because we know that hormone therapy can cause people to express different secondary sex characteristics. So the difference between the two is one of gene expression, which is its whole old field of study and a very interesting one, and one I would recommend that you engage in. But just know that these things are not simplistic, they're not binary. They're not binary for anyone. They're highly complicated. Yeah, sorry, your hand's been up a long time.
My arm is so tired.
I'm very sorry about that.
We're all males at one point in the womb.
Yeah, and again, even that is a bit of an oversimplification, but what is not an oversimplification to say is that the female body type is essentially the base plate and the starting point. And all of the male secondary sex characteristics just involve some things growing more and developing more, and other things growing less and developing less, right? And yeah, so it is the exact same body plan with different growth happening as a result of different hormones. Some of those things, some of these, what we call the secondary sex characteristics, those are fluid and can be changed throughout your lifetime. And this is why, with hormone therapy, people can develop breasts or stop developing breasts, or all sorts of different things like that, why they can grow body hair or stop growing body hair. And then the things we call the primary sex characteristics are just as based on hormones and just as fluid. The only difference is those developments have happened by the time somebody reaches puberty. I was going to say born, but that's not quite true. But by the time somebody reaches puberty, their primary sex characteristics are sort of set in stone. They're biological. And when we alter those surgically. Yes?
So since, being females, the template in the womb, is that why men have nipples?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, because again, it's the same body type. And men also have mammary glands. They're just not largely developed. And not to give too much information, but you eat too much and they start to develop a bit, right? And you eat a little less and they develop less. But that's also true for females, right? These things are not nearly as separate. The idea that there's a male body and a female body and those two things are very different just is not supported by biology. The truth is that they are the same body template, largely with very small tweaks to them. And that's not to say that biological sex differences aren't real. They absolutely are. It's just to say that there's a very common misunderstanding that you have a Y chromosome and everything that codes for being male is on that Y chromosome. So if you have a Y chromosome, you're male. And if you don't, you're female. That's not how it works at all. Really, the Y chromosome has a little gene called SRY that says hey, turn on all those male sex characteristics. And this gene is not perfectly expressed. It is neither 100% expressed nor 0% expressed in anybody. Instead, like all gene expression, it's somewhere in the middle, which is why some people who are biologically male are very prototypically male. They're big and broad-shouldered and tall and whatever, and have all those traits. And some people who are biologically male are much less stereotypically male, right? They're more slender, they don't have as deep a voice, they have less body hair, whatever, all those stereotypically male things. And it is not like all of those traits go together. Somebody can be big and tall and deep voiced, but not have much in the way of body hair or whatever, right? It's not just that it's not that the entirety of masculine versus feminine is on one gradation. Every single trait is on a gradation because every single trait is on a continuum of expression. The study of gene expression is called epigenetics. I don't have time to get into it here, except to say it's probably the most interesting thing I studied, and I took a course that covered it for a few weeks, and I was like, wow, that's interesting, and I would love at some point in my life to go back and really study it because it's fascinating stuff. Okay, so with that in mind, let's keep talking about the sex chromosomes. So, every single person on Earth has at least one copy of the X chromosome. You must, because there are genes on it that you need. And by the way, just because it's the sex chromosome doesn't mean that all the genes on it are related to sex and gender and things like that. Not at all. It's got all kinds of genes on it. It's got, famously, the genes that give you color vision are found on the X chromosome. We're going to talk about that in a minute. So it's got all kinds of genes, but everyone has at least one copy of the X chromosome. The Y chromosome contains genes, mainly one called mainly a gene called SRY, Sorry.
Would there be a little gap?
I don't know what you're talking about. It was always there. Yeah.
What about intersex people?
We're going to talk about that because that can. There are a lot of different reasons for that. Some of which are chromosomal, but not all of which are chromosomal. So it's a very good question. We're going to talk about it in just a couple of minutes. So first, I'm going to give you the kind of in general version. And so this applies to most people. Not all people, but most people. Generally speaking, people have one of two configurations. And people who are male, I'm going to start with female actually, people who are biologically female and people who are biologically male. And again, I say generally speaking because a substantial portion of people, well, a minority, do not have these arrangements. And that...
Interruption.
Yeah.
Hello?
Hello?
Hi, yes, Jennifer correctly with you?
Yeah.
She's supposed to come down for a photo retake.
Yeah?
Thank you.
Okay. I didn't hear any of that.
Okay, there's no way you didn't hear anything.
I mean, I heard it. I heard sound. I didn't understand it. I think somebody's going for photos. Who's going for photos? Jennifer is going for photos. Jenny, did you hear that?
Yeah.
Okay. Are you just going to knock it? Should I send them an email? Or I guess they'll just figure it out.
I actually don't see it happen.
I'm a little curious myself. Let's see. Okay. So, in general, females have chromosomes. They have maternal chromosomes 1 through 22. And from their mother, they get which chromosome? Which sex chromosome? X. Good. And from their father, a female will get a copy of chromosomes 1 through 22, and they will also from their father get females? X, yeah. Typically, people who are biologically female have two sex chromosomes, X and X. And they get one of their X chromosomes from their mother and one of their X chromosomes from their father. And so we would write about this that their chromosomal arrangement is that. We don't bother writing 1 through 22 because everybody has chromosomes 1 through 22. Okay. On the other hand, people who are biologically male, from their mother get chromosome 1 through 22. From their father get chromosome 1 through 22. And then what else do they get? What sex chromosomes do people who are biologically male typically have? Do they have two Y chromosomes? No, so they have... Cool. Who do they get the Y chromosome from? Who?
Father.
Are you sure?
Yeah,
Why?
because he's the one that already has a wife.
Yeah. If people who are biologically female have two X chromosomes, can they pass along a Y chromosome?
No.
No, you can't pass along something you don't have, right? So, the Y chromosome is passed on patrilinearly. And matrilinearly, the mother always supplies an X chromosome. Which partner determines the biological sex of a child?
Why are your M's lowercase and everything else capital?
I don't know. Is that better? That isn't much better. Is that better?
Sure.
Okay. I will try to do that.
Then female too.
Okay. Okay. Well, I'm glad we did that.
You're welcome.
So, I got interrupted. Who determines the biological sex of the offspring?
The father.
The father, yeah. The mother has nothing to do with the biological sex of the offspring because the mother always supplies an X chromosome. So it is the biological father whose sperm determine, and roughly speaking, what percentage of a male individual's sperms will have an X chromosome? About 50. And what percentage will have a Y chromosome? 50. I've read at various points that there are different survivorship ratings for sperm in sort of different conditions depending on which chromosome they have. I've never seen anything conclusive to suggest that there's actually much to that. I'd be curious to read more about it, but I've never done so. Yeah, we're going to talk about that. It's not that it's dying. It has been shrinking, but that doesn't seem to matter because it's mostly just junk DNA. Really, the gene on it that is doing much of anything is just one little gene.
Is it like the settings gene? It like triggers a bunch of settings that we hadn't used without it?
So we'll say again, every ovum contains an X chromosome. What's an ovum again? It's an ovum. Yeah, female sex cells, female gametes are called ova. Ova is plural, ovum, singular. They are held in the Eastdale sex ed coming through again. The ovaries. They're held in the ovaries. Good. Sperm, on the other hand, may contain an X or a Y chromosome.
Where's your dash between that? You're slacking it.
I'm all right. I'm a solid B+.
I don't think that's solid.
Okay, now.
Passing.
Okay, one sec. I do want to mention something. Which is that, like, there is a surprising percent. My wife's a midwife, so she was very surprised to learn how frequently babies have what we call ambiguous sexuality, which is to say it's not clear at birth whether it is a male or a female biologically. And the reason it's not clear is that a sizable percentage, not a huge percentage, but in the single digits, a meaningful percentage of babies are born where it is ambiguous whether they are biologically male or female. They exhibit some of the sex characteristics of both. Do you know what historically was done in that cases? And by historically, I mean well into the 2000s. Yeah, like up to about the year 2000 before that. What would people do? Yeah. So what we used to do is we used to say, a doctor would come up to mom and dad who, mom has just pushed a living being out of her body and is exhausted and tired, and would say, essentially, pick one. Like, here's your baby. Its gender is ambiguous. Pick a sex, and that's what you're going to raise this baby as. And they would, operate right then and there and just make a choice. And is it any wonder that, a society that has lots of people whose sex was not, in fact, one thing or the other, very clearly, but were raised to believe that those were the only two possibilities, is a confusing and difficult place for a lot of people who've been through that. This should not come as a surprise to anybody. What we are beginning to do is just say, just wait and see. The fact of the matter is that sex and gender don't really make much difference to how somebody is until they are approaching pubescence. So just wait and let this person discover for themselves what they feel their sexual and gender identity is, and then we can act at that time. And that seems to me a much more humane and healthy and holistic approach to things. But I just want to mention, sometimes somebody may have an X chromosome and a Y chromosome, and looking at them genetically, we would say, well, that person appears to be genetically male, and yet to look at them, they have no male sex characteristics whatsoever. That happens. Likewise, sometimes somebody has two X chromosomes, and we genetically look and say that they genetically appear to be female, and yet they exhibit male sex characteristics. They have a penis, they have no breasts, they have, right? Like, and to say nothing of people who are in the middle, where they have signs of both. That is altogether common. It is not the case that even everyone's physical phenotypic sex matches the chromosomal conformation, because again, the genes that form the penis and the scrotum and the testicles and body hair and all these things are not held on the Y chromosome. They're in all of the chromosomes, all spread out, just like all the genes that code for everything else. So you asked a question about intersex people earlier, and the answer is it is not 100% true that people who have two X chromosomes will only exhibit female sex characteristics. And it is not true that people who have an XY chromosome combination will exhibit male sex characteristics. Because you're talking about thousands of genes interacting with each other, intersexism is just a result of different hormonal balances, different gene expression, and lots of things like that, though it can also be chromosomal. And we're going to talk about that in about 5 minutes. Did that half answer your question? Great. Hopefully in a few minutes I'll the other half answer your question. Okay, so now I want to mention inheritance and chromosomes. How far are we going to get here? I think we'll make it. We might not make it, and that's okay. So far, we have treated genes like they are perfectly randomly assorted. I'm going to say, like, using our Punnett squares. So yesterday, when we did a dihybrid cross, we said that, if we're talking about the gene for seed color and the gene for seed shape, that those, that a seed would either have one combination or the other, but we acted like all the combinations were equally likely. And typically speaking, that's true. By and large, so like usually we would say, if a mother has, let's say big A, big B, little b, we would assume that the gametes, the sex cells, her ova, would be what possibilities? What are the possible combinations that you could get from this? Okay, so we could get big A, big B. So I'm going to kind of color code these as we go. So we could get big A, big B. What's the next combo we could get? Big A, little b. Very good. What's the other combination we could get? Little a, big B. And finally, little a, little b. Okay. And normally we would say that each of these is equally likely. But what would prevent these from being equally likely? Dominant gene is going to control the phenotype for sure. So this phenotype is less likely than the other because this phenotype you need to be recessive, sure, but that's not really what I'm driving at. Let's say that this big A and that big B both come from the maternal side, and the little a and the little b both come from the paternal side. What if those two genes happen to be on the same chromosome? Well, then when random assortment happens, yeah, the chromosomes are randomly assorted, but those two genes will go together. Now, they could still get split up because there's another process that mixes our genes up. What's the other process that mixes our genes up? We have random assortment and we have crossing over. But what if they're on the same chromosome and they're on the same chromosome really close to each other, right next to each other? Then they are almost certainly going to move together. Does that make sense? So, if genes are on the same chromosome, they are more likely to move together, and the gametes are less likely, some gamete combinations are less likely than others. If two genes are on the same chromosome, they will randomly assort together unless crossing over. Yeah, sure. You don't have to ask me that, as you know. So if two genes are on the same chromosome, then the combos aren't equally likely because they will randomly assort together unless the genes have crossed over. And so their gamete genotypes are not equally likely. I'll give you a minute to write that, and then we'll draw a little picture of it, because you know I'm very good at art, and I like to show off. Ready? I'm ready. Okay. Here is my maternal DNA, and here is my paternal DNA. All right, there we go. Let's say this is chromosome, I don't know, give me an autosomal chromosome. What chromosome are we looking at?
17.
Chromosome 17, I like it. All right. All right, paternal and maternal chromosome 17. And let's just say that these genes A and B, let's say they're on here, and let's say that actually this is where my little a is, and this is where my big B is. Does that make sense? And obviously they're going to be at the same place here. But since what do we call it when you have one copy of each again? Heterozygous, good. Since I'm heterozygous, if my maternal copy had little a, my paternal copy must have big A. And because I was heterozygous for B, if this one had big B, this one must be little b. Okay, there we go. Now, what are the combinations then? Well, unless crossing over happens, these two chromosomes are going to get pulled to opposite sides. So the most common thing would be that I would be little a, big B, or big A, little b. On the other hand, I would need crossing over to happen if I was going to be little a, big B, or big A, big B would require crossing over, which does happen, but it doesn't happen all the time. So this is less common. No, I mean, little a is still recessive. It just means that you can only do a Punnett square and trust the results if those chromosomes are on different, or those genes are on different chromosomes, which is actually why we know. Can I tell you a fun story? Could someone remind me, who was the scientist who studied pea plants and first led us to genetics?
No one can remember.
Oh, you said nobody could remember, and then the person closest to me just said the correct answer. Gregor Mendel is correct. Thank you, person who remembered the thing that nobody could possibly remember. Well, one of the things we like about Gregor Mendel is we know he lied. Because he had collected a bunch of data, and he reported it, and it led to that, and he came up with all these ratios. But some of the data he collected, we know he must have changed his numbers. And you know how we know he changed his numbers? He actually picked a couple traits that were on the same chromosome, and he reported the numbers as if, like all the other ones, they were perfectly spread out, and gave us that nice 9:3 to 3:1 ratio we saw yesterday when we did the dihybrid cross. But if two things are on the same chromosome, like we showed here, you can't trust random. You can't assume that they're random because they're not. And so we know that Mendel, as he kept going with his studies, wanted people to believe him, and he had these couple traits that were stubborn and didn't give him nice results. And you know what he did?
Why?
And he changed his numbers, which is bad practice. So, you know, boo on him. But on the other hand, you know, whatever. People listened to him, so he was vindicated in the end. Anyway, does this make sense? This is a pretty esoteric concept. A little confusing. Does it kind of make sense? What if I have time to get into the other? Oh, hell, I'm away tomorrow. We're doing it. Sorry, guys. I'm punching through this. We're going to get to the end. Okay. The last thing I want to say is that, yeah, okay, we'll just do the whole thing. We have time. And if we run out of time, whatever. We'll pick it up on Thursday. I'm sure you guys would love that if I just kept going. Let's talk about genetic diseases. You're going to do a whole project on genetic diseases.
Yay.
But there are three types of diseases that are caused by your genes. The first one we're going to speak very little about. Because we're going to do a whole day on it later. All right? So the first type is what we call autosomal disorders. You guys can tell me right now what kind of chromosome causes an autosomal disorder.
The autosomal chromosome.
Good. Which are which ones? Where there is a gene on chromosomes 1 through 22 that has a mutated allele. What do we mean when we say a mutation? What's it mean to have a mutation? That just means a... Yeah, change. Mutate is to change. Scripture tells us that the love of God is immutable, unchanging. What else mutates?
Viruses.
Yeah, well, yes, as we all know. When we get a new variant on COVID, which seems to happen all the time, it's because it has mutated. It has changed. So this is a change in the DNA sequence.
A gene on C1, C22 that has a mutated?
Oh, I'm sorry, has a mutation.
The biology teacher.
I'd like to think of myself as both. A change in the DNA sequence. And I'm not going to talk about this too much now, but we can say there are dominant and recessive diseases. Sometimes a mutation is of the sort where just having one copy of it makes something stop working properly. That's a dominant disease. Other times, having one good copy is enough to have no problem, and you have to have two copies. For a dominant disease, where D is diseased and little d is normal. Why did I use D in this case? Sure. And would I always use D for disease with any genetic disease? We'll see. So anyway, if I had genotype, my genotypes could be big D, big D, big D, or little d. What would my phenotype be in each of these cases? If I'm big D, I would be... Settle down. If I am carrying two copies of the dominant diseased chromosome, or gene rather, I would have what phenotype? I'd be diseased, right? What if I'm the heterozygous case? What if I have one of each? Yeah, because this is dominant. And what if I have two normal copies? Yeah. And by the way, in biology, we throw normal around a lot, and I know that can be a term that makes people be like, especially if you have something like we discussed genetic disorders a few years ago, and I had Kayla Miliuski in my class who had a rare genetic disorder. And I spoke to her once after and said, like, you know, the proper language is normal and diseased. Is that going to be difficult for you? And she said, no, like, I've been through medical treatment all this time. I'm used to hearing that. But just be aware that that is the, like, proper terminology. But that doesn't mean you necessarily want to go around throwing that in casual conversation, because it can be pretty insulting to somebody to say that, like, oh, you know, all of these people are normal and you are diseased. Do you know what I mean? So it's language you want to be careful with, because just because something is correct doesn't mean it's the way you want to speak to people on a day-to-day basis. So that's my public service announcement for don't be a jerk in how you talk about diseases. Okay, so we have the dominant diseases case, and then we said diseases can also be, yeah. And in the case of a recessive disease, would I use D to stand for diseased? No, because by convention, which letter do we use? We use the letter that is short for the dominant case. So what letter am I going to use here? N for normal. Good. And again, that's not a big thing. It's just a convention. And if big N is normal, little n would be diseased. Good.
Excuse the interruption.
Yeah.
Hello?
Hello.
Hi. At the break, could I have Ryan Marion to the main office?
Yes.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I got that one. They want to see Ryan.
Of course you got that one.
I got that one. Look at that. Okay.
Excuse this interruption.
No.
In the cafeteria,
No.
Cream of mushroom soup for $2. A Caesar salad for $3.75. Shepherd pie with a side salad for $5. Thank you.
Okay, guys, that was so quick. Wow. If somebody had big N, they would be normal. If somebody had little n, they would be diseased. Yeah, sorry, I skipped there. Obviously, this person would also be normal, but we have a word for this. We say that if you have one copy of a recessive disease, we say that you are a carrier. So they would be phenotypically normal, but they have that gene, which means that potentially if they came across a spouse who was also a carrier and they had offspring, two parents who don't have a genetic disease can have children who do have a genetic disease. I know she wouldn't mind me talking about this because she gave a whole presentation about it, and I asked her and she gave me my blessing. But Kayla Molyuski, did anyone know Kayla and Jackson? They were here a few years ago. Just some of the loveliest kids I ever taught. But they both had a rare genetic condition. They're both very, very small, and they both could walk, but had trouble with it. So they both rode around in motorized chairs. Just the nicest kids ever. I adore Kayla and Jackson. Jackson was like my buddy. He was like the nicest kid in the world. And Kayla was in plays for me. And she was great. Anyway, but their disease is so interesting because their disease is recessive, but it's so rare because people who have, I want to get this right, people who have, even as a carrier, are infertile, which means that it has to come about by mutation, not being carried on, but the mutation actually has to happen in mom and in dad because it's a recessive trait that has to come about by mutation. So there's only like a few hundred people in the world who have the disease they have, which is pretty crazy. Yeah. No, not all. No, it shares something in common with that because they're both quite little. But no, I will actually look up. She did an amazing presentation on it that I still have, and it's super cool. It was really interesting. Guys, would anyone mind if I'm gone tomorrow, but if in the first 15 minutes of class tomorrow was the end of this note just playing up on the screen, would that be all right? And then you'll have a little assignment that you work on. I know that pre-recorded lessons aren't the nicest thing in the world, but does that work? All right, I'm going to let you be. Have a wonderful day, guys. Sorry I didn't get through that.